All right. Hello and welcome to another TPS Tech Talk brought to you by the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program and also the Technology Committee. A light crowd today. Apparently not a ton of interest on podcasting and primary sources, but our goal is to take 30 minutes to convince you otherwise for those that watch this after the fact. So I'm Taylor Kendall with the TPS program at MSU Denver, and also Keith Patterson. If you want to do a quick intro.
Yeah, we're next door to Taylor Kendall here at Metropolitan State University with the TPS program. Yeah, really, this was sparked by, and honestly, several years ago, with a long commute into work and some time to kill in the car, and honestly, Taylor in the office next door, turned me on to a couple of podcasts, and
we are literally a door away from each other.
Yeah, we have to close the door so we can't, so we can go all the way across the internet to next door. But basically, having interested in listening to something a little more educational on my drive-in besides, your standard whatever's on the radio, and just being more efficient with my time and kind of broadening my horizons. Kind of got into some podcasts and to really expand my horizons, and over the past few years I've expanded out. I have probably 30 podcasts that I watch, and I was noticing that in a lot of cases that the materials that these podcasts are being based on, and some of these are really being pulled from very educational and historical topics, and a lot of the stuff is actually being pulled from the Library of Congress. And thought it would be, very interesting technology talk about, maybe talking about some of the favorite podcasts, some of the technology, how to get into it. It's a little bit daunting. It's got some issues with different platforms, whether you're a Mac person, an Android person, and thought that we could, talk a little bit, field some questions from anybody that might have, suggest some podcasts that are a good place to start, that are a good way to kill some time on your commute. And so just kind of starting there, not really quite sure what part to bite off first. I think kind of what spurred me to really put this up for a topic was a while back I was listening to it's not just a podcast, it's an NPR public radio show that they do called Radio Lab. And if you have not heard that, I would recommend doing that. I think we have a link in the showcase off to the side there if you can scroll down. But just a great way to spend an hour of your time in general, just to learn something and get a different perspective. But they had actually done a piece about the Carlisle Indian School, which was an Indian assimilation school back in the day. And if you want to learn more about that, it's the podcast is a good way to learn about it. But basically, the Indians, Indian, not necessarily the appropriate term, that's what they called them at the time. The idea was to, rather than let them live a native life, it would make more sense to have them be assimilated into white culture by taking the kids away from their parents and shipping them off to schools for them to be turned into good little white children. And part of that was they played football, and there's a whole story behind the Carlisle School that had a very good football team, and had a whole story behind that was covered in depth in this Radio Lab story. And after listening to that, having worked with some resources at the Library of Congress, I went back. There's a primary source set at the Library of Congress teachers page that talks about assimilation through education, and actually has some resources directly from the Carlisle School and the people that they're talking about in the story. So it added another dimension to those resources that are at the Library of Congress through some of this in-depth research that they had done. And so that kind of was a nice thing I posted up on the Teachers Network, and another plug for that, if for those of you who are a member of that, if you just search assimilation or Indian schools or any of that stuff, that should pop up, and you can see the conversation that happened around that. There was other resources. I think somebody put up some stuff about Indian school basketball, some other things from up in Montana. So it was a nice way to kind of share some resources that are an interesting topic to teach. So that was a good place to start. And I don't know, Taylor, if you have any other podcasts that kind of spark some of that. I have some other things I can share, or we can go from.
Yeah, I followed Radiolab kind of on and off, and then I think you actually tipped me off to that specific episode. And I'm looking at us doing these hangouts and realizing that, you know, we have so far to go as far as engaging an audience. If you want to see how you can take a historical topic like that and really make a production around it and really have it be an engaging piece of content, Radiolab does that as well as anyone, and that's a great example. They take these obscure topics, weird angles on things you just wouldn't expect, and they build this just really well produced piece around it. And so, yeah, well, you know, again, kind of feeling like we're being left in the dust the way we do these when you listen to something like that. But they got a bunch of money and obviously a lot of resources behind being able to produce them, and the audio that they build in is all cut perfectly and just builds a super compelling story. And yeah, that one in particular, as far as primary sources go and the Library of Congress, I think that's a good spot to start to get a feel for kind of how a podcast could supplement a topic like that. But yeah, we have a list. I think there's probably maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 of these that we'll share that kind of fall in that same vein of just kind of taking an obscure topic. Some of them very closely related to things you might find at the library and historical sources. Some just, you know, some take a whole another angle and are, you know, go in weird sort of cognitive psychology directions, or so none of these are specific to the digital resources that we're all familiar with. But I guess, you know, we should point out that the library does do their own podcast series, lsc.gov/podcast. And so, you know, it's sort of a different angle on it. Theirs is very library specific and a little more scholarly, but they obviously do their own too that aren't quite as story based as some of these other ones. But yeah, Radiolab, perfect starting point. Radiotopia, Keith, you can probably talk a little more about that, but they have a few. One of the podcasts they do is 99% Invisible, which I follow a lot. This American Life is really well known and popular. That's probably in the same kind of vein of telling cool stories. Yeah, we'll try to make sure these are all shared. If you haven't used these Google Hangouts much, there should be a little sort of I think there's like 9 square dots that make up sort of a cube-looking thing at the top. Clicking that gives you access to the different sort of apps, one of those being the Showcase app. And that's where we're posting some of these links. And we'll also, Keith, I might turn it back over to you. I'll also post this document that we've been kind of just posting and sharing some things back and forth. I'll post that up to the comments on the Google Plus page here real quick too. Yeah,
thanks, Taylor. Yeah, it's just there's millions and millions of different podcasts out there in a bunch of different ways. I just wanted Taylor to talk a little bit about Radiotopia, which, if you think in the realm of a podcast of kind of like a mothership for different podcasts, and they're actually like a home base for several. They actually have several that I found to be really historically interesting in pulling resources. There's one called Radio Diaries, and they pull information from all over the place, but they tend to have historical information. Just take a look at their page and some of the stuff they've pulled up. Of course, Dead Air is nice, but they had a story about some stuff about English writing and relating that to a bunch of different stuff. Something about Jules Verne's lost novel. They had a piece about that, doing all sorts of different stuff. I may have got me another one. Yeah, he mentioned the stuff at the Library of Congress, and that's really they're pulling more from their pool of you know, amazing experts on subjects that they have in house. There, you know, they have stuff from from the National Book Festival and from their different reading rooms and literacy and digital preservation. And they have a podcast that they do on slave narratives from the slave narrative collections and the research on those. And so a bunch of great stuff there. So, we could talk all day about good resources that we've seen, but it's just more of get in and listen. And another thing I thought we could talk a little bit about is maybe how to access these, because that can be a little tricky depending on where you're at. Because with radio and that sort of thing, I think most of us are fairly frequently about how to turn on the radio in the car and find a station to listen to. But podcasts are a little more tricky, and so for the most part, I think most people listen to podcasts on their mobile devices. And I think I could speak a little bit more to the Android system or those line of devices, and I think Taylor probably is a little more attuned to the Apple products and how to do that.
We realized we were the perfect two. Even though there's only two of us on here, we're the perfect two because we fall into each camp and know each product's a little better. So
yeah. So as far as Android, if you're looking into getting into it. So the dichotomy, and it's always the argument between Android and Apple, and to take the straight and narrow line of not being more biased towards one or another. Besides the fact that I pretty much stick to Android stuff. So the Android is going to be a little bit more flexible as far as what you can do with the podcasting, whereas the Apple stuff is kind of like you're going one direction. We'll talk about that. But with Android, kind of once you have to get an app to pretty much make it work and to access the stuff. But I've used two, and I've used them both for a amount of time. The other pluses and minuses, but I have two that I would pretty strongly recommend. And the one I'm kind of leaning toward at the moment is a program called Pocket Casts, and the other one is a program called Dog Catcher, and they pretty much go the same route with stuff. They allow you to discover new stuff. So they'll look at, they'll give you, when you first sign up, they'll give you like some standard, most popular kind of things. And you can go with that route. And then from there, you can kind of search topically in either one of them. And they get you all set up. Makes it incredibly easy to search through things. And then once you kind of get a few things in there, it'll start recommending based on what you like and your interests to feed more information to you. And from there, pretty much you can set them up to, as soon as new stuff comes out, it'll download them for you automatically. So when you hop in the car in the morning, you just got to turn it on and roll with it. And I think it's pretty much the same thing with iTunes, with the Apple products, but I'll let Taylor talk a little bit about his workflow and any tips he's got with that.
Yeah, we had a background sneeze. Now you guys know I'm not alone here.
Never alone.
Yeah, I mean, for those on the Apple side, I agree that it's less flexible, but it's in some ways easier. They build it straight into the OS, so it comes sort of default. You can't get away from podcasts if you have an iPhone or an Apple-based product. They have sort of a built-in app that works into the operating system. So I brought it up. I don't know if you can see. This is my list of podcasts, but again, this is built into the OS itself. So all I have to do is go to the iTunes Store, search for the podcast that I'm looking for, and subscribe to it. And so that then automatically I'm pretty much set up. And as new podcasts come out for that, for whatever podcast that is, then it just automatically gets pushed. And I will say I got to be careful because I have like Keith, I have probably 20 or 30. And I was saying I have to do like some pruning every month or so, just because the automatic nature of it, they just keep downloading, and they're pretty big files. So they'll take up a lot of space on your device pretty quickly. But they have features like auto delete. So after you've listened to one, it'll automatically delete it. And it's surprising how many like actual workflows and things there are built into just listening to podcasts.
Yeah. That's one of the nice things about the Android, both of those apps, and you can go into it forever, but they have highly customizable. You can tell it which ones you want to download automatically, how many of those you want to download automatically. We know if you prefer to download it or stream it, or automatically stream it if you're on a Wi-Fi network. All these sorts of crazy things that if you're a super geek like I am, that it's kind of nice and you can get it all set up the way you like. But yeah, it's crazy workflow and all that stuff.
Yeah, I'll show one of the thing about some of these bigger podcasts, like Radiolab, they all have like devoted web spaces that, are more than just the options to subscribe to their podcast. So another one that we, I think both have found is pretty awesome in sort of its storytelling capacity is something done by someone called Dan Carlin. He does a podcast called Hardcore History. Let's see. He has this sort of web space at dancarlin.com/hardcore history series. And so he has these episodes sort of built out, tiled, really awesome, just sort of well-developed and well-produced stories around, sort of these pivotal events in history. And so, again, this is a more familiar sort of web experience, but if I go to one of these, you can see it'll give me options. And he kind of just updated this actually, but so I could listen to it directly on the web here, or it gives you options to obviously go out and download it from wherever it's available to. So a lot of this stuff, and you can see there's some he builds these out pretty thoroughly. Now he's got funding to do these sort of in a bigger scale. So he's got some primary sources often tied to these. You can see a map that's all, and if you were to listen to this episode and then come back and look at some of these resources, you really get a cool understanding of some of these historic topics. So again, some more funded and built out like this than others has gotten a lot of press and a lot of good accolades recently. So that's why his is looking a little more polished than some. But anything else here? I know we're only in about 20 minutes, but I think our biggest goal was to, sort of cue you in on some podcasts that we are really into, and I think offer a lot when it comes to, history and can make really cool ties to primary sources, and then a little bit of the technology that kind of goes along with it.
Yeah. The only other thing I was thinking about, and I was just kind of racking my brain. I mean, neither of us are classroom teachers, Taylor, but I was thinking of extending these podcasts as something that could be used in the classroom or as enrichment. And the only really good example I had was, that Radiolab episode on the Carlisle School and how well that dovetailed with those assimilation resources. And we as advocates of primary sources, we're always one to add that additional context to those primary sources. And I just think of how powerful that'd be if you take, that primary source set, bring them around, and I don't either you front load it by letting them listen to the podcast first, or you let them do analysis of the primary sources, first, and then say, okay, now go home tonight, listen to the podcast, and then we'll discuss it tomorrow. And just thinking how much that would add more dimension, because you get a feel for more of the personalities of the people involved and more of the backstory and some of the issues that were happening in the day, because they take that time to go into depth on the context and what was going on. Yeah,
so here I just I think just because this specific episode is such a good spot to start with, give you an idea, and I think if nothing else from this, go. If you've never podcasted and you just want to get into it and try one, I'd say get into Radiolab and listen to this specific episode. And we'll share. I didn't actually share the link out, Keith. You could probably share the link to this specific episode. It looks like.
Yeah, I linked to the Teachers Network part of that, but that doesn't help everybody if you're not signed up. If you're not signed up, sign up for the Teachers Network. This is the great stuff that's in there.
So they build a lot of the context and pull in some sources around this story as well. But again, it's the combination of supplementing the way they build and produce a story via audio, and then linking it with these visuals. We were actually surprised in their lack of use of Library of Congress stuff. A lot of this is coming from the Cumberland County Historical Society, and our thinking is that they perhaps just didn't even go that direction or know that the library had what they did around this topic. So maybe we should follow up and tell them they missed a piece by not including some of the library sources. But
yeah, I remember going in, and it's in the Teachers Network piece of this, but there was resources in the primary source set that were directly related. They had a nice picture of before and after, which they also had in this set, but kind of this is what they looked like first day they walked into the school, and this was 3 months later. So they're all in their garb they would have come off the prairie wearing, and then 3 months later they're in suit and tie, hair trimmed, all prim and proper. And they're just such powerful in those images. That's why they're as part of that set. But then I also just hopped into Chronicling America and just searched for their part of the conversation is around a kind of a mythical championship game between the white schools and the Indian school, and what happened because of that. And I won't really go into much more than that, but there was newspaper articles that were able to be found from Chronicling America, which actually kind of gives you I always like to call those my little time machines, because you get a step back in time and see how the stuff was reported, and very interesting addition to the story. So, just amazing, taking that little bit and then kind of how that, even in my case, that made that a connection with me and said, hey, I wonder what else I can find. And, that can happen with your students. I mean, it'll happen with yourself and with your students. So just amazing how that happens. Looks like we actually might have some questions here, Taylor.
Yes, our I believe possibly one and only viewer, Mary, good to see you. She had asked, do you always download your podcast before listening to them? And also, how do you auto-delete podcasts you've listened to? I pretty much am at the point now where I subscribe, and so it's an auto, the download. I'll show you how the auto-deleting happens. But I'm comfortable enough to where I now just subscribe to it. And, if a few episodes come up, some of them are released weekly, some of them more, the timing of them is variable as far as when new episodes come out. So I've just gotten used to letting it download. And if I see a couple that come up, I'm like, I don't want to, I know I won't listen to that. So I'll just delete those. But I still I subscribe and let the sort of the downloading to my phone happen all automatically. Keith, I don't know if you have as far as getting a hold of them, I think you're probably the same way. You just subscribe and let it happen. Yeah.
I mean, it's so much easier. Once you kind of find something you like, you subscribe, and like as Taylor said, you just sometimes that just doesn't work out with podcasts. You have to cull them after a while, and so your list doesn't get too long. But once you subscribe, any of the Android applications, and I've used the iTunes before, and it's the same thing. It's just a setting in there where you just say auto delete or how long. I think in most of the apps, and I don't remember specifically because I think you just leave it to once you listen to it, delete it. But I'm trying to see on my app here what it does.
Yeah, I can only speak from the Apple end, Mary, but you go into the actual, and again, I'm on an iPhone 5, and you go into the actual settings. So I'm in my settings here. I know this isn't so clear, but you have an actual option for podcasts, not from within the podcast app itself, but from your phone settings. There's specific settings for podcasting since it's built into the OS. And one of the options when I come in there is, and I'm not sure if probably won't be able to see this, but there's a little toggle here, and this is says delete played episodes. So if I have that toggled on, then it's going to delete them after I listen to them. It's got a bunch of nice, I have my refresh time. So how often should I look for new ones? Episode limit. So you could set it. I actually have it set at 3 per podcast. So I only get the latest 3 download episodes, only new. So there's a ton of settings, which I think people maybe aren't aware of, that happen on the sort of operating system side and not necessarily per podcast. But yeah, it makes it pretty easy to sort of, really specialize the way you interact with them. I know a lot of people, actually, there's a big trend right now, which is really weird. I was just having a conversation about people that listen to their podcasts in 1.5 and 2x. So they'll actually speed up and I'm sure you can do that from the Android side too.
Yeah.
But there's people that listen to, and there's debates as far as how you're processing that information sped up at 1.5 or 2 times. I can't listen to it at 2 times. I will listen once in a while at 1.5. And I think I feel like I get the same experience. Keith, do you ever do any of that speed up?
Yeah, I mean, that was a feature that Dogcatcher, or at least I don't think, didn't have, but Pocket Cast did, and it'll let you, and it's actually more aggregated. You can actually do like 1.1 up to 5 times. And so I actually bumped it up to like 1.2, and then it also has a feature where it'll take out any silence that's over a certain amount of time, and then it actually tracks and tells you how much time you actually saved by doing that. So it keeps a little running thing, and you go back and it says that you saved 5 hours listening to podcasts, and I'm like, wow, that makes a huge difference. Either that or I listen to way too many podcasts, which is probably more the case.
It's like justifying your experience. It's like, yeah. I know you're addicted, but look, we cut out 5 hours of your podcasting time, so clearly you're being more efficient.
And at 1.2, you only notice it if you've been really used to hearing somebody's voice, because it goes up just slightly. And then also when they play music, it's like, you're like, it's not quite right. It's too fast. But other than that, it doesn't. Do it
per podcast. That's totally what it is. Yeah. Some of them that are, more just conversational, I'm okay with it. But yeah, the ones that are really more well produced and have a bunch of different sound effects and stuff, it starts throwing you off, and you can't quite follow it because of what it does to different sound effects and music and stuff.
Yeah.
So one last question here, and I don't know that I can help a whole lot here, but Mary asked if we're aware of any student-done podcasts around primary sources. I can point to one example that we were involved in a while ago. But Keith, can you think of any?
You're probably thinking of the same one, and if it's not the one you're talking about, I will pipe in.
Let me see. I was going to bring it up here. A while back, this I think was probably 7 or 8 years ago now, so these are a little dated. Really probably when podcasting was just sort of even coming to be a big thing. Let me share here. We had a group of students. Zoom in here a little bit. We had a group of students that put together a series of podcasts on the historic Colfax. So this is a sort of Colorado-specific podcast, but they were looking at the different historic sites along Colfax Avenue, which is, the old, I think maybe the longest and oldest road in something. It's got historic significance, and obviously people in Colorado know it well. But so it was a project where the students took different groups of students took these different sort of themes and actually visited these different sites along Colfax, and then created this podcast series. And I don't think it's gonna, obviously can't play it through, but we'll link out to this. So if you're interested in at least hearing one example of what students could possibly do, they did a pretty awesome job. And again, this is, I think we're talking 7 or 8 years ago, so the technology's come a long way, and it's a lot easier now. They had to put a ton of work into it, but it still came out pretty good.
And that was what I was thinking of. So back in my head, I seemed to recall there was some other stuff, but I don't recall. If anybody knows of any good projects where students have done podcasting, or if we come across or remember something, we'll just post it either on YouTube or on the Google Plus events page. And speaking of which, we did create a Google Doc that we're warehoused a lot of our links and podcasts and links out to the Android apps I mentioned. And obviously, if you've got an Apple, you know what iTunes is, so you probably can figure that out. And anything else we talked about, we'll throw on that document and as kind of a repository for finding some of the stuff.
Yeah, and that's in the Showcase app. It's there, and it's also on the Google Plus page now. You might have to dig for it a little bit. I shared it at 4:10 p.m. So find that timestamp, and that's where that exists. But that links out to pretty much every podcast that we thought was worth sharing. I have a whole other sort of personal list on there that isn't quite as history and primary source driven, but Inquiring Minds I really like, put out it's through motherjones.com. The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, they've gotten a ton of really great feedback, and they're a big group of sort of science advocates that do a weekly podcast. That's probably the one podcast I'm at the point where I just don't miss. I'm like excited Sunday when it comes around to know that I get my next episode coming that week. So, but those are all shared on that document.
Yeah, and if anybody's anything to share or anything, just feel free to add to the conversation after the fact. So.
Yep, and we'll say one last time here, hashtag TPS Tech Talk. Anything you do around these, please use that hashtag so we can kind of keep everything in line. And again, I'll just say thank you, Mary, for joining. Now, we had a few come in and out, but thanks for joining, and for those that listen to it after the fact. And if you have any ideas or suggestions on topics, want to facilitate or participate, we'll plan to keep doing these in the future. So look forward to any suggestions. Until next time, thanks, Keith.
Yep, thanks, Taylor.